You are listening to the Tales of Conundrum podcast, episode 16, The Liar. Part 1, Seeds of the Scam. Jack Bennett liked to tell himself he was born under the streetlights, raised by the dim glow of neon bar signs and flickering alley lamps that formed an impromptu canopy above the only world he'd ever truly known, the hustle. Even as a kid, Jack discovered he had a knack for reading people, for spotting their hopes and fears in a single glance. He became the sort of child who, during a harmless game of cards, would palm an ace or flick the corners of the deck to find the queen, all without blinking. When he was 10, an older cousin, already knee-deep in minor fraud, showed him how to slip a cheap watch into a package meant to return a more expensive one. For Jack, it was like realizing he was fluent in a secret language no one else could decipher. He felt clever, unstoppable, and oddly validated in a world that rarely acknowledged his existence otherwise. Years later, perched on a cold bench in a crowded train station, Jack pulled off one of his simplest early scams. He remembered it vividly. A frantic traveler had left a carry-on bag unattended for just a few seconds. Jack casually took a seat next to it, making a show of checking the time on his phone as if awaiting a friend, then slipped the traveler's wallet from the side pouch the instant he saw an opening. The traveler was none the wiser, and Jack calmly strolled away. It was small, hardly worth bragging about, but it was the principle. He could do it, and he could do it without leaving the faintest trace. Over time, those tiny victories compounded, shaping him into the cunning, unrepentant con artist he was now. Tonight, as the neon lights bled across the wet sidewalks of downtown, Jack was in the middle of his latest swindle, a sophisticated twist on an old favorite, the promise of free money. The victim was a desperate man named Doug, who'd lost his job 2 weeks ago and was drowning in overdue bills. With the city's homeless shelters filling up faster than usual, Doug had the hunched posture and darting eyes of someone who believed luck had truly abandoned him. He clutched a ratty old phone, the screen chipped and flickering. Jack approached with an air of casual generosity. He smiled warmly, shoulders relaxed, giving the impression of someone who made a comfortable living in tech or finance and had grown bored with the monotony of corporate life. Jack had specifically chosen a street corner near a payday lender's neon sign, where troubled faces often congregated. Doug was an easy mark, down on his luck, eager for any shred of help. "Hey, friend, you look like you could use a hand," Jack said, pulling out his own phone. Sleek, black, a model that wasn't even available in most stores yet. "I've got a little extra cash today, feeling generous, you know?" Doug blinked. "Seriously? You don't even know me." Jack shrugged, his lips curling into a sympathetic grin. "Believe it or not, I've been there before. I know what it's like to have no one lend a hand. Let me send you a couple $100. Maybe it'll help you get on your feet." The desperation in Doug's eyes flared into a flicker of hope. He hesitated, glancing around to see if there was a camera crew filming a reality show. When he spotted nothing unusual, he responded with the faintest tremor of gratitude. "I mean, if you really want to." Jack nodded. "Of course," he said, forcing warmth into his tone. "We'll do it by Venmo so it's instant. Just scan this QR code on my phone, and it'll link our accounts." From an outside perspective, it looked like an ordinary Good Samaritan moment in the city's otherwise cold night. But the code on Jack's phone wasn't just for a peer-to-peer transfer. It held a small, custom virus, one he'd paid good money to develop. The moment Doug scanned it, it would give Jack's phone near immediate access to Doug's payment apps, transferring every dollar Doug had, and then displaying a false balance on Doug's screen. By the time Doug realized his funds had disappeared, Jack would be long gone, the scammed money siphoned off to anonymous accounts. Doug tried scanning once, but his phone's camera didn't catch the QR code in the low light. Jack, forcing concern, stepped closer, adjusting the brightness on his phone. "Here, try again. It should work this time." There was no hesitation or tremor in Jack's voice, only smooth confidence. He had done this dozens of times. As Doug finally got the scan to go through, Jack cast a quick, assessing glance around the street. He was mindful not to linger under the same security camera for too long and poised to vanish if needed. Seeing no obvious threat, he relaxed. Over the years, Jack had built a sprawling repertoire of hustles, each refined through trial, error, and an unrelenting desire to stay ahead of the game. There was the old-fashioned change con. Walk into a corner store with a $100 bill, ask for a specific breakdown of smaller bills, then pretend to change his mind at the last moment, leaving the clerk confused. In that dizzying exchange of money, Jack always managed to pocket an extra $10 or $20. It was simple, but effective. Then there was his pride and joy, the moissanite ring swap. Moissanite gemstones resembled diamonds close enough to fool the untrained eye. Whenever Jack spotted someone wearing an impressive diamond ring, usually an unwitting woman flaunting her engagement band, he'd go into performance mode. He'd compliment the ring, ask to examine its cut, slip it briefly off her finger, all while palming his prepped moissanite copy. A deft swap, a little misdirection, and suddenly he walked away with a ring worth thousands, leaving behind something that glimmered just enough to delay the victim's realization. His phone-based scams, however, were his new frontier. The possibilities of digital theft excited him because the world of finance was shifting toward instantaneous, intangible transactions that few truly understood. People saw a QR code and assumed convenience, rarely thinking it could be a gateway to burglary. His custom encrypted phone acted as a Trojan horse for those apps, and Jack leveraged that fact like a magician unveiling a trick that dazzled and deceived. What made Jack especially dangerous was his face, or rather, his forgettable one. He was in his early 30s, brown hair cut short, with a clean shave and average height. His build was neither especially muscled nor overly thin, and his wardrobe featured nondescript hoodies, plain jeans, and neutral jackets that blended in anywhere. Cameras never caught a standout detail. Eyewitnesses never remembered a tattoo, a scar, or an unusual accent. He was an everyman, a perfect ghost who could walk into someone's life, rob them blind, and walk away unnoticed. As Doug fiddled with his phone, seeing a prompt that suggested he'd magically receive $200, Jack couldn't help the twinge of satisfaction that coursed through him. "There," Jack said cheerfully. "Hope that helps." Doug, wide-eyed, stared at the new balance on his screen. "Wow, I don't know what to say. Thank you." "Don't mention it," Jack said. "Really?" Jack's confidence surged. He believed he was untouchable, one step ahead of any mark or cop who might try to chase him down. The anonymity of it all thrilled him, that perfect blend of adrenaline, cunning, and the knowledge that no one could pin him down if he planned well enough. He had no regrets, no moral qualms. To him, the world was a game board, and if someone was desperate or gullible enough to fall for his pitch, that was on them. At least that's what he told himself in the quiet hours of the night, when the city finally slept. At that moment, hidden away in the labyrinth of digital code, Doug's funds had already been routed into Jack's alternate accounts. By the time morning rolled around, Doug's phone would refresh to a balance of 0, but it would be far too late. Jack would have disappeared, just another face in a sea of strangers. No con is ever perfectly silent, though. There's always the rustle of fate that might disrupt even the smoothest operation. That disruption came in the form of a small, curious figure standing behind a row of dusty newspaper vending machines. The figure was a 5-year-old boy named Kody. He was short, sporting an oversized jacket with sleeves that nearly covered his hands, his sneakers stained with the grime of the city's rainy streets. Dark curls peeked out from under a hood. His large, inquisitive eyes were locked on Jack and Doug. When Jack politely excused himself from Doug and began strolling down the sidewalk, Kody stepped forward with surprising resolve. "Hey!" the boy shouted, voice clear as a bell cutting through the night's hum. Jack froze. A child calling out could mean anything. Maybe he was lost or needed help. Jack's typical response was to ignore it and keep walking. But something in the boy's voice snagged his attention, like a single note of a melody that refused to fade. Turning around, Jack found himself face to face with a gaze far more intense than any 5-year-olds had a right to be. "Are you talking to me, kid?" Kody nodded. "I saw what you did." The air seemed to chill. Jack took a moment to scan the area. Doug was gone, likely hurrying back to wherever he called home, oblivious to his plundered bank account. There were no police in sight, no watchful store owners. Just this kid. Strange. "What I did?" Jack repeated, feigning ignorance. "What do you mean?" "You lied," Kody said, matter-of-factly, as though stating the color of the sky. "You took that man's money. You said you were giving it to him, but that's not what happened." Jack tensed. Most kids might not notice or care, certainly wouldn't be bold enough to accuse a stranger in the street of such a thing. "Listen, kid," he said, voice low. "Real life isn't all rainbows and butterflies. People gotta do what they can to eat and put a roof over their head, all right? For a moment, Kody was silent. A flicker of sadness crossed the boy's face. Jack expected the usual wave of confusion or fear, the standard reaction from someone who realized he was dealing with a street-savvy hustler. Instead, Kody took a step closer. He didn't look scared. In fact, he looked oddly calm. "From this day on," Kody said, each word falling into the night air with a quiet weight, "you must always tell the truth." Jack's brow furrowed. He could barely process how strange the words sounded coming from such a small figure. The kid's statement carried an uncanny sense of finality, like a gavel striking down in a courtroom. "Yeah, sure, kid," Jack said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Whatever you say." Without another word, Kody turned, his small frame vanishing into the gloom between two tall buildings. Jack stood there, momentarily dumbfounded. He exhaled, shaking off the odd feeling that clung to him. It was just a kid's silly remark, a naive sense of justice in a world that chewed people up and spat them out. Right? Jack shoved his hands into his jacket pockets and started walking. The city had quieted, and the only sounds were the hiss of passing tires on wet pavement and the distant thump of bass from a nearby bar. A swirl of neon from a half-broken sign illuminated his path. He forced a laugh, shaking his head at the absurdity of it all. "Must always tell the truth," he muttered under his breath, sarcasm dripping from every syllable. What does a 5-year-old know about real life anyway? And yet, an unsettling sensation trailed him all the way home. He tried to brush it off as nothing more than the residual adrenaline of the night's hustle. Perhaps it was the lingering echo of Kody's voice, or maybe just the knowledge that he'd scammed another desperate soul moments before. Jack wanted to believe he felt no remorse. He'd always told himself that people were responsible for their own gullibility. But something about that encounter with Kody left him restless, as though a tiny sliver of doubt had slipped into his world, lodging itself where he couldn't shake it loose. Still, by the time he reached his small apartment building, Jack had mostly managed to bury the boy's words beneath the comforting logic of his own cynicism. He would count his newly acquired funds, maybe even celebrate with a decent dinner, then plot tomorrow's moves. After all, the hustle never ended. And that was the only truth he believed in. As he stepped into the fluorescent-lit hallway of his apartment complex, Jack gave one last glance over his shoulder, half expecting to see Kody standing there in the shadows. There was no one. The corridor was empty. Satisfied, Jack shrugged and headed inside. The curse, if one could call it that, lay dormant in the hushed stillness of Jack's thoughts, waiting patiently for the moment it would come alive and shatter his perfect con artist existence. But for now, tired, unconcerned, and riding the temporary high of yet another successful swindle, Jack couldn't see the oncoming storm that a child's strange proclamation had just set into motion. He locked his door, tossed his jacket onto a chair, and let a slow grin stretch across his face. "Tell the truth," he repeated softly, voice dripping with irony. "Yeah, sure thing, kid." His smug grin held, unwavering, as he turned off the lights. In Jack's mind, tomorrow would be no different than all the days before, an endless hunt for the next unwitting mark, the next easy dollar. Little did he know, the gears of fate had already begun to spin in a new direction, and by the time the first rays of morning crept across his windowsill, his world would never be the same. Part 2. Truth Unravels. Jack woke the next morning feeling an odd, lingering buzz at the back of his mind. The events of the previous evening should have faded by now. Another scam successfully executed, another mark left believing they'd received easy cash. Yet, as he stood by the kitchen counter sipping a cup of cheap coffee, Jack found himself returning again and again to that strange encounter with the kid named Kody. He almost told himself it had been a dream. It would have been simpler that way. But every time he pictured those determined eyes, the memory solidified like wet cement drying in the sun, refusing to let him slip back into his old routine without noticing something had changed. He shoved the thought aside. He had a schedule to keep, and the day waited outside his door with the same opportunities it always had. That quiet corridor of his apartment building felt especially stale this morning. Flickering fluorescent lights, chipped white paint, and an unmistakable odor of burned toast drifting from behind a neighbor's door. Passing the stained walls, he tried to refocus on his next target. He'd scouted a handful of possible marks over the past week and felt particularly confident about a young woman named Serena who frequented the cafe on 8th Street. From overhearing her worried phone conversations, Jack knew she was behind on rent and desperate for a solution. Desperate people were prime prey. He walked the 8 blocks to the cafe, letting the city hum around him. Cars snarled in traffic, and the tang of exhaust mingled with the sweetness of a bakery next door. Voices drifted from passers-by, some cheerful, others weary. Jack's gaze flickered from one face to the next, always hunting, always calculating. The morning light painted sharp angles on the buildings, as if highlighting all the hidden corners he might duck into if needed. Serena was already there, sitting on a bench in front of the cafe, staring at her phone. He watched from across the street for a moment. Her posture sagged, and she exhaled sharply as if she were reading bad news. Probably an eviction threat. Perfect. Jack casually crossed the street, plastering on a friendly grin that he'd practiced 1,000 times in mirrors and quiet alleys. He approached her with carefully curated nonchalance. "Good morning," he said, tipping his head in greeting. "Sorry, I couldn't help but notice you look a little down. Everything okay?" She looked up, eyes rimmed with fatigue but flickering with polite acknowledgement. "I'm fine," she replied, though her tone suggested otherwise. "I've been there," Jack said, letting a touch of sympathy creep into his voice. "Sometimes the bills just won't stop piling up, right?" A breath of uncertainty flitted across her expression. "Something like that," she admitted, then tried a wry smile. "But life goes on." Jack nodded, slipping smoothly into the role of a concerned stranger. "I'm actually on my way to the bank." He patted his pocket, where he kept his phone. "I had a bit of luck with an investment recently. If you don't mind me saying, you look like someone who could use a quick break. Let me help." She eyed him as if not sure whether he was serious or playing a weird prank. "Help how?" "Simple, really. I can send you some money right now," he said, producing the phone that housed his custom QR code. "Just open your Venmo and scan this. It'll link you to my account." A swirl of hope and caution flickered on her face. "That's awfully generous," she said hesitantly. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" "Let's call it paying it forward," Jack answered, forcing the words into a gentle laugh. "Someone once helped me when I was in a tough spot, so I'm returning the favor." Serena seemed to consider it. Finally, perhaps too tired to argue, she opened her Venmo app. "Okay," she murmured. Jack tapped his phone's screen, pulling up the malicious QR code. He held it out. "Just scan here." Victory felt inevitable. He anticipated that surge of satisfaction at the moment she scanned it. But then, something inside him, a strange pressure in his chest, tightened as though an invisible vice were winding around his lungs. Her phone camera lined up with his screen. The connection beeped. In that instant, the old Jack Bennett would have thought, easy money. He would have been counting the seconds until the virus gained access to her account. But before he could fully bask in the thrill, he felt the words slipping from his mouth. "Actually, I'm stealing your money. This code is a scam." His voice rose louder than intended, each syllable slamming into the space between them. Horror raced across Serena's features as she backed away, phone clutched protectively to her chest. What did you say?" Jack felt his pulse hammering, a rush of panic fused with disbelief. Had he just admitted to the con out loud? Of his own volition? There was no sarcasm, no sly grin. It was a raw confession, plain as day. I'm trying to scam you," he repeated, like a man compelled to read from a script he never auditioned for. "The code will drain your account and send the money to me." For a moment, they both stood frozen. The city noise buzzed around them, irrelevant. Serena's expression flickered from shock to confusion to anger. "You're sick," she whispered, voice trembling. Then she spun on her heel and bolted down the sidewalk, as if convinced this might be some bizarre hidden camera stunt. Jack couldn't breathe. The grip on his phone felt icy, and his mind reeled. He wanted to chase after her, to pretend it was all a joke. He wanted to run from the entire morning and bury himself in the safety of his old illusions. Instead, he just stared as she disappeared around the corner, heart pounding a frantic drumbeat in his ears. It had happened. He had told her the truth. And the strangest part was, he couldn't stop himself. Something in him had forced the confession out like an unstoppable reflex. Anxiety churned in his gut, intensifying with every step he took away from that cafe. Finally, he turned onto a side street, feeling a sheen of sweat break out along his hairline. He needed to breathe, to calm down, to figure out what was happening. But the day wouldn't relent. Like an addict refusing to believe his luck had run out, Jack latched onto the idea that this was a fluke, that maybe the stress of seeing Kody and hearing that weird command had planted a seed of guilt. He'd push past it. After all, he'd scammed dozens, maybe hundreds of people. One moment of weakness wasn't going to derail his entire operation. He decided to shake off the fiasco by performing one of his simpler, more tried-and-true cons, the ring swap. He made his way to an upscale park known for its jogging paths and yoga classes, a place where wealthy residents liked to flaunt their status. In under an hour, he spotted a likely target, a woman sporting an impressive diamond engagement ring, shining in the midday sun like a beacon. She seemed calm, sipping a smoothie and typing on her phone, easy enough to approach. Jack walked up with a disarming smile. "Excuse me," he said politely. "Sorry to bother you, but I couldn't help noticing your ring. That's an incredible cut. My sister is looking at engagement styles, and I'd love to show her an example of this if you don't mind. Could I take a quick look?" The woman, seemingly flattered, removed the ring and handed it over with minimal hesitation. Jack felt that old sense of predatory confidence spark in his veins. He held the ring up to the sunlight, swirling it slowly as he reached into his pocket where a moissanite imitation ring was stashed, ready for the swap. But the moment he touched the fake ring, an invisible shock seemed to course through him. His mouth opened, words tumbling out without warning. "I'm going to swap your real diamond for a fake ring, so I can steal the original." He heard his own voice, loud and clear, echoing in the quiet hush of the park. The woman's jaw dropped, her eyes flaring with disbelief. "Excuse me?" she practically shrieked. A flush of horror scalded Jack's cheeks. What was happening to him? I didn't mean to say that," he stammered. But even that was a confession, wasn't it? Panic swelled in the woman's face. She snatched her ring back and stumbled away, muttering something about calling the police. Jack could do nothing but stand there, stricken, as the plan shattered around him once more. Minutes later, a painful knot twisted in his stomach as he tried one last hustle for the day, the old change con at a small convenience store. He approached the clerk, laid out a crisp $100 bill, and asked for smaller bills in a flurry of chaotic instructions. Usually the confusion ended with Jack pocketing an extra 20, but halfway through, he found himself blurting the truth. "I'm trying to shortchange you out of your register money." The exasperated clerk banged the cash drawer shut, hurling a string of curses as Jack scrambled to leave before it escalated into a full-blown confrontation. By now, it was undeniable. He couldn't lie if his life depended on it. Every time he tried to scam someone, a crushing compulsion forced him to reveal his real intentions. The humiliation of it burned like acid. The scoreboard of his day was staggering. 0 successful scams, 3 self-sabotaging confessions, and a deeper wedge of baffled fear in his chest. For the next couple of hours, he drifted aimlessly through the city, the illusions of his craft unraveling with every step. A distinct part of him wanted to rage about it, to break something, to scream at the cosmos for punishing him. But an odd new emotion, something uncomfortably close to relief, peeked out from behind his frustration. As he replayed each mortifying confession, a sliver of relief slid into him like a bright thread among dark fabric. No cunning justifications, no running from the truth. In a twisted way, there was a strange, almost liberating clarity in it. And then came the most bizarre twist of the day. A well-dressed older woman wearing pearls and a finely tailored blazer strode up to him near a florist's shop, sporting a quizzical half-smile. "I saw what you tried to do back there," she said calmly. Jack stiffened, every nerve in his body bracing for confrontation. "Look, lady," he said, "I'm not in the mood, okay? I heard you tell that store clerk you were trying to swindle him. You admitted it openly." Her tone was curious, as though she were reading an interesting newspaper article. Why would a con artist just blurt that out? Jack's eyes darted around, seeking an escape route. But she didn't look angry or afraid, just oddly intrigued. He exhaled, and once again, honesty erupted from him like a confession he couldn't contain. "I don't know," he said, voice shaking. "I can't lie. It started this morning. Everything I do, end up telling the truth? The woman studied him with an unexpected glimmer of admiration. That's very unusual, she murmured, but refreshing. Then, to Jack's utter astonishment, she opened her purse, took out her wallet, and counted out 10 crisp $100 bills. Take this, she said, pressing the money into his hand. I appreciate the honesty. He stared at her, baffled. Why would you? It's worth it, she said. Consider it a reward for showing me how not to be scammed. Next time a fast-talking stranger comes along, I'll know all their angles. You just gave me a crash course in con artistry. She winked, then turned and strolled away, leaving Jack paralyzed on the sidewalk, $1,000 heavier, but no less confused. The money felt almost hot in his hand, like it might combust at any moment. The rest of the day, he wandered the streets in a haze, unable to reconcile this bizarre new pattern of forced honesty with the small fortune someone had given him for it. As dusk bled into the city skyline, Jack felt a wave of exhaustion roll over him. He decided to head back to his apartment, but before he could, the echo of raised voices caught his ear. The street he was on ran beside a public school building, its fence topped with sagging chain links. With curiosity piqued, he slipped around the corner, remaining half hidden by the tall fence. In the orangey glow of the streetlights, he spotted a young kid, couldn't be more than 14, shifting nervously from foot to foot. Towering over him was a lean man in a hoodie, face partially concealed, who clutched a small plastic bag of something powdery. The kid fumbled for money, clearly about to buy drugs. Jack's first instinct was to walk away. This wasn't his business. Normally, a drug deal near a school was the sort of scene Jack would brush off, if he even noticed it at all. But something inside him churned, a fierce disapproval flaring up before he could shut it down. The memory of Kody's solemn, piercing gaze flashed across his mind. Without fully understanding why, he swung open the gate, stepping into the light. "Hey!" he barked, surprising even himself with the strength of his voice. Both the dealer and the kid froze. The dealer glared, eyes sizing up this unexpected intruder. "Move along," he growled. Jack's pulse hammered, but he raised his hands in a placating gesture before pointing at the kid. "You don't want to do this," he said, voice trembling with earnestness rather than fear. "Trust me, it'll chew you up." "What are you, a cop?" The dealer's tone dripped with menace. "No," Jack admitted. "I'm just someone who knows that once you go down this road, it's real hard to turn back." He turned to the kid, who looked torn between fear and shame. "You're young. You get out of here, you stay in school, you stay away from guys like—" He gestured to the dealer. "Like us." Silence. The kid pressed his lips together, crumpled the money in his fist, and stuffed it back in his pocket. Then, in a rapid blur, he pivoted and ran. The dealer spat a curse, but didn't bother chasing him. "That's your loss, clown," the dealer snarled, squaring his shoulders at Jack. Jack's instincts kicked in, screaming at him to brace for a fight or to run. But the dealer took a brief step forward, scanning Jack's stance, and must have sensed an unusual resolve in him. Perhaps it was the raw honesty on Jack's face. The same curse that had destroyed his scams all day long now gave him an undeniable authority. The man hissed another insult and backed away, slipping into the night. For a long moment, Jack stood alone in the dimly lit space, heart pounding. He expected an adrenaline crash, a regret that he'd meddled in something that wasn't his affair. But what he felt instead was pride. Genuine, startling pride, like a weight lifting off his shoulders. In that fleeting instant, he felt more alive than he had scamming half a dozen marks in one day. Truth spilled from him like a newly tapped well, and with it came this unexpected release. He turned and walked off, the distant sound of traffic merging with the steady thud of his heartbeat. The city's glow stretched overhead, and for once, it didn't feel like a harsh glare, but a gentle light guiding him. As much as he loathed to admit it, his entire perspective was shifting. Each step away from that school confirmed a new truth. He was changing, compelled by an honesty he neither asked for nor understood. And surprisingly, that thought wasn't entirely unpleasant. It was unnerving, sure, but maybe, just maybe, it was also setting him free. Part 3. A Thief's Honor. After stepping in on that drug deal near the school, Jack had assumed he'd wash his hands of the whole incident and move on to the next strange twist of his forced honesty life. Yet the universe seemed determined to make him face the fallout head-on. He found himself back on that same grimy street corner the following afternoon, footsteps echoing on the cracked sidewalk. He was on the hunt, not for a new scam, but for a new way to keep the lights on. Because without the ability to cheat people out of their cash, Jack's finances had dwindled at an alarming rate. As he squinted against the afternoon glare bouncing off shop windows, a voice called out with quiet menace, "Hey, hotshot." Jack froze mid-step. Standing by a battered payphone booth was the same lean man he'd confronted the other day, the one who tried selling drugs to that teenager. Only now, the man seemed more poised, like a snake coiling before a strike. "Name's Daz," he said, rolling the syllable as though savoring it. "You cost me a sale yesterday. You got no idea how that messes with my rep." Jack exhaled slowly. He felt a flicker of unease in his chest. The name Daz rang out like a warning bell, sharp and ominous, even if he'd never heard it before. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said. It was the truth. What choice did he have these days? If he so much as thought about bluffing, he'd betray himself with an unbidden confession. Daz clicked his tongue against his teeth and glanced around, confirming no bystanders stood close enough to overhear. "Too late for that, man. We're in trouble territory now. You step in on my deal, you let the kid run off, then you talk some hero nonsense." His lips twisted into a sneer. "You'll regret costing me a sale. Think I'm joking?" Jack felt his pulse thud like a hammer in his ears. The old, cunning part of him itched to feed Daz a carefully spun lie. He could claim ignorance, pretend it was all some misunderstanding. But that strategy wasn't an option anymore. "I'm not a hero," Jack managed, voice steadier than he expected. "I just didn't like seeing you push poison on a kid, that's all." "Awfully high and mighty." Daz stepped closer, eyes narrowing. He looked ready to throw a punch or pull something worse from his jacket. "You one of those do-gooders?" Jack's breath caught. The small flutter of fear that uncoiled in his stomach was undeniable, but that same eerie spark of honesty that had been plaguing him also filled him with a peculiar sense of confidence. "No," he said simply, "but I couldn't stand by and watch you do it." For a moment, Daz's face contorted with indecision, as if he couldn't decide whether to lash out or dismiss Jack as a fool. A tense silence hung in the air. A passing bus rumbled by, stirring a gust of hot exhaust that swirled around them. Finally, Daz spat on the ground near Jack's shoe. "You're gonna see real soon how bad that idea was." Without another word, he turned on his heel and strode away, shoulders squared, the line of his spine electric with aggression. Jack let out a ragged exhale once Daz was out of sight. The last thing he needed was a vendetta with a street dealer, especially since, thanks to his truth curse, he couldn't lie his way out of any confrontation that might erupt from it. But he didn't have time to dwell on it. His rent was overdue, groceries were low, and every hour that passed without a new source of income spelled trouble. For the next few days, he trudged from one business to another, picking up every help-wanted flyer he found tacked to windows or plastered to notice boards. With no formal resume to speak of, and more skeletons in his closet than he cared to count, he soon discovered this new honesty of his could be just as damning as it was liberating. Every interview started the same: polite introductions, a few awkward questions. Then the interviewer would inevitably say something like, "What makes you think you'd be a good fit here?" Or, "Tell us about your background." Jack's forced candor kicked in, painting a disturbing portrait of cons, scams, and endless hustles. He tried to phrase it gently. He wasn't required to give every gritty detail, but there was no escaping the confession that he'd made a living ripping people off. One by one, potential employers shut him down. Some laughed in his face, some stared in fascinated horror, and still others looked genuinely concerned for his mental health. Either way, the answer was always a polite no, or a vague promise to call you if we decide to move forward. A new low point arrived when he found himself with a near-empty wallet and nothing but the reflection of his own tired eyes in a bus shelter advertisement. At some point, hustling had become not just an occupation, but his entire identity, and now that he couldn't do it, he felt like an actor whose script had vanished. One morning, drawn by rumor of a new security firm, Jack pushed open the door to a cramped office that smelled of stale coffee and printer ink. A single desk lamp illuminated a messy stack of folders, while a man with salt and pepper hair tapped away at a keyboard. This man wore a shirt a size too big, sleeves rolled up to reveal arms crisscrossed with faint scars. A well-worn nameplate on the desk read, Jeff Kingsley. Jack waited until Jeff looked up. "Help you?" Jeff asked, arching an eyebrow. He had a directness about him that felt more honest than the usual corporate politeness. "I'm here about the security guard position." Jack tried to manage the tension that tightened his shoulders. "Saw your flyer on the bulletin board outside." Jeff nodded and gestured for Jack to take a seat in one of the battered metal chairs. "I need reliable people," he said, cutting to the chase. "Folks who won't doze off on overnight shifts or bail after 2 weeks. Mind if I ask about your background?" Jack swallowed hard. He considered a half-truth, maybe claim he'd done the odd security gig, but his new reality made that impossible. He cleared his throat. "I'm a crook, or I was, until about a week ago." Jeff didn't jerk away or explode with outrage. He just leaned back, crossing his arms, studying Jack's face with an intensity that implied he'd seen plenty in his life. "Define crook." "Scams," Jack replied. "Credit card fraud, ring swindles, you name it. I was good at it, but I'm trying to stop. I can't lie anymore. Literally can't." He paused, watching Jeff's reaction. "I get it if this is where you tell me to leave." A silence stretched out. The fluorescent overhead fixture buzzed, flickering against the grimy ceiling tiles. Jeff tapped a pen against his desktop. "You can't lie anymore," he repeated, as if mulling over the confession. Jack nodded. "I know it sounds crazy, but that's the truth." Jeff's expression shifted into something that almost resembled a grin. "Well, I've had worse applicants," he said, shrugging. "At least you're straightforward about it. Most folks try to bury their skeletons." Jack blinked. "Are you serious?" "Serious enough to give you a shot." Jeff opened a manila folder, flipped a few pages, then pulled out a form. "Fill out your basic info. We'll start you on a probationary basis. Low pay at first, but if you can prove you're dependable, we can talk about raises." Relief flooded Jack's chest so powerfully he almost forgot how to breathe. He took the form, scribbling down what he could: name, phone number, a few references who might not disown him. The pen trembled slightly in his grasp. "I've been short on staff for a while," Jeff said, leaning forward. "You work the graveyard shift, patrol the building next door, keep an eye on the cameras, do a few walkarounds. No heroics, got it? If someone tries to break in, you call the cops. If they won't leave, you call me. Think you can handle that?" Jack nodded again, still reeling from his luck. "Yes, sir," he said, hearing the sincerity in his own voice. It was the only way he could speak now, anyway. Jeff flipped the folder shut with a decisive snap. "Good. You can start tomorrow night. My lead guard will show you the ropes." As Jack stood to leave, Jeff tossed him a final glance. "Why the change of heart, by the way?" Part of Jack wanted to shrug it off, but the conversation demanded an answer. "Let's just say I realized scamming folks isn't all it's cracked up to be," he replied. "And maybe life's giving me a chance to do something else." Jeff nodded with an inscrutable half-smile. "Well, let's hope so," he said. Outside the office, the relentless afternoon sun seared the sidewalk, and Jack felt something he couldn't quite name. Part pride, part apprehension. It was an alien sensation to step into honesty rather than spin illusions. A job. A real job. He caught his reflection in a tinted window and hardly recognized the expression on his own face. This could be a turning point, he told himself. Maybe. That night, in his cramped apartment, he laid on his bed, letting the silence seep into him. A few days ago, he'd have scoffed at the idea of going straight, but the bizarre truth compulsion had forcibly stripped away the hustle. He couldn't con the world if he tried. So now here he was, a soon-to-be security guard. The irony wasn't lost on him, someone who used to rob people now guarding property. But no matter how he turned it over in his mind, he couldn't bring himself to regret this unexpected direction. He did, however, regret crossing Daz. Because while Jack might have found a semblance of a new life, he doubted the city's underworld would stand idly by. Someone like Daz didn't just let a personal offense go. And indeed, across town, in a dimly lit back room of a dilapidated warehouse, Daz was making good on his promise. In that smoky half-light, Daz paced in front of a metal table littered with half-empty bottles of cheap liquor and scattered bullets. Across from him sat a broad-shouldered man with a stony face. Turk, his uncle. Thick cords of muscle lined Turk's neck, and he had the calm, predatory air of someone who'd seen and done worse things than most people could imagine. He listened as Daz recounted how Jack interfered with his deal and warned the kid away. "You want me to rough him up for shutting down a little transaction?" Turk asked, voice low and measured. He took a slow drag from a cigarette, the tip glowing like a cold orange star in the gloom. "That's not the half of it," Daz growled, frustration twisting his features. "He acted like he owned the streets, told me to beat it. Man's gotta learn he can't disrespect me like that, especially not in our territory." Turk exhaled a stream of smoke. "What's his name?" "Jack Bennett. Dunno much else about him, but he's trouble." Turk made a vague gesture, smoke curling around his knuckles. "We'll keep an eye on him," he said. "Anybody messing with you is messing with me. Don't worry." While Daz's posture relaxed slightly, he also recognized the quiet finality in Turk's tone. An unspoken truth hovered between them. Messing with Turk's operation, even if inadvertently, guaranteed a swift and brutal response. It was a matter of time. Jack had no idea he was being discussed in that shadowy room. No notion that the threads of his fate were being tugged in directions he couldn't control. He went about his day, gathering what few possessions he had in a small backpack, preparing for his first security shift. It was a modest job, the pay hardly enough to brag about, but it was a start. On the appointed evening, he arrived at the building Jeff had mentioned, a tall gray structure with battered windows and a flickering neon sign that announced a half-defunct real estate company. Jeff's lead guard turned out to be a middle-aged woman named Sheila, who wore a crisp uniform and seemed almost grateful for new help. She gave Jack a quick tour: the fluorescent-lit lobby, the cramped control room with several outdated monitors, the back alley exit where petty thieves often tried to slip in at odd hours. Every step reminded Jack of the lines he used to cross with ease: security cameras he could outsmart, blind spots he knew how to exploit. Now he was on the other side, nodding along as Sheila pointed out ways to spot suspicious behavior. As they walked, she asked her own share of questions. The third time she inquired about his background, that surge of honesty hit again, forcing out a brief statement about scamming folks. Her eyebrows shot up, and she glanced down at the laminated card clipped to his belt that read Jack Bennett, security staff, as though double-checking she had read it correctly. When she didn't immediately tear it off him or call Jeff to complain, Jack felt relief pool in his chest. Maybe Jeff had already given her some heads up, or maybe Sheila just believed in second chances. An hour into the shift, the building settled into a hushed stillness. Sheila left Jack alone in the control room, instructing him to rotate through short patrols of the hallways every half hour. With the hiss of the air conditioning and the dull glow of the monitor screens, he couldn't help but think how surreal it all felt. A part of him kept expecting an alarm to blare, or a con job to reveal itself from behind a corner. But no, this was his new life. Tame, quiet, and painfully honest. Between patrols, he sat at the console, thumbing through a worn training manual that outlined standard operating procedures. Occasionally, a car engine revved outside, or the lights flickered. Each time, Jack's pulse gave a tiny leap, old reflexes telling him something might be up. But every time, it was a false alarm. And there, in that humming monotony, he realized he felt almost at peace. No constant vigilance to keep from letting a lie slip, no elaborate scheme to orchestrate and then vanish from. He simply had a job to do. The meager sense of accomplishment that brought was new, perhaps even comforting. Still, as midnight stretched toward 1 a.m, Jack's thoughts drifted to Daz and the parting threat that lingered in the air. A single question gnawed at him. What if Daz came looking for him? And deeper than that, what if Daz wasn't the real threat at all? People like Daz always had bigger fish behind them, a chain of command that ended with someone far more dangerous. Tension gathered beneath Jack's ribs like a coil, reminding him that the city's underbelly had a long memory. Truth or not, walking away from the hustler's world wouldn't grant him a magical shield. If anything, his forced honesty might paint an even bigger target on his back. Street criminals rarely welcomed transparency, and dealers tended to guard their turf with brutal efficiency. He tried to shake it off and focus on the small bank of monitors in front of him. Grainy black and white feeds of empty corridors and locked doors. A thin line of sweat beaded at his temple, though the room's air conditioning was set to high. For an instant, He wished he could still slip into a smooth lie if someone came looking, but that skill was gone, replaced by an unflinching compulsion he had yet to fully understand. However, as the night continued without incident, a tiny bloom of pride took root. He was doing a real job, earning a paycheck in a way he never had before. And thanks to Jeff's inexplicable willingness to give him a chance, he was on the cusp of a new chapter in his life. It was enough to let him breathe a little easier, even as the potential storm brewed on the horizon. He finished his final patrol shortly before dawn, walking the hallways in near silence, only his footsteps echoing off the walls. A flickering light in a stairwell and the hum of a distant vending machine were his only companions. By the time the sun's first rays began to sneak through the front windows, the pale glow found Jack leaning against the reception desk, mind drifting through all that had changed in just the past week. Outside, the city roused itself for another day, commuters heading to work, deliveries rattling over potholed streets, bleary-eyed cafe workers unlocking doors. Jack thought about his old life, the easy money, the sense of always being one con away from striking it big. But now that path was barred to him by something bigger than guilt or caution. Strange as it was, he didn't entirely miss it. Not when he could stand here, just a face among many, doing something that didn't harm anyone or require him to outsmart the world for a quick buck. Yet an unmistakable disquiet throbbed beneath that fragile peace, like a second heartbeat. Daz was out there, and so were others like him. People who didn't like interference, who responded to perceived disrespect with brutality. It wasn't paranoia, it was the nature of the streets Jack knew too well. And behind Daz was Turk, the rumored kingpin of that particular slice of the underworld. A man with enough muscle and clout to reach out and crush a nuisance anytime he chose. Jack couldn't say how, but he sensed the looming confrontation with more certainty than he'd felt in a long time. It was just a matter of when. For now, he settled into the guarded optimism of his new uniform, his new role, and his new vow of honesty, hoping it would be enough to keep him afloat when the city's shadows finally came calling. Part 4. Crossfire in the Streets. Jack's shifts had settled into an uneasy rhythm. He'd walk the corridors, watch the outdated security monitors, and count down the hours until dawn. It was safer than his old life, on the surface at least. Yet every night, he felt a small knot of tension, coiled tight in his chest. Paranoia? Maybe. Except he couldn't forget the vengeful promise that hovered in the corners of his mind, courtesy of Turk and his nephew Daz. When the city finally dropped into the lull between midnight and sunrise, Jack roamed the block around the office building, on alert for anything suspicious. The neighborhood was quiet, almost too quiet. A single street lamp flickered, painting the deserted sidewalk in a weak glow. Faint graffiti scrawls decorated the brick walls, and the only movement was the swirling trash caught in a passing breeze. He completed his usual loop around the perimeter, wearing his new security jacket with a mixture of pride and wariness. A wave of relief swept through him when he saw no sign of trouble. He reminded himself not to grow complacent. Trouble usually found him whether he wanted it or not. As he neared a rusted mailbox on the corner, the low growl of an engine made the hairs on the back of his neck prickle. A sleek sedan rumbled toward him, headlights cutting through the dark in a blinding wash. The vehicle was moving slower than normal traffic, like a predator stalking its prey. Instinct ignited in Jack's gut. He knew that pace, that watchful approach. He froze, muscles tensing, trying to decide if he should duck into the adjacent alley or stand his ground. The decision was made for him when the car accelerated with sudden force, its engine roaring to life. The passenger window slid down in one swift motion. Jack's heart slammed against his rib cage, and he dove behind the mailbox just in time to hear the explosive crack of gunfire. Bullets ricocheted off the metal box in a shower of sparks. One whizzed past Jack's shoulder, making his breath stick in his throat. Everything went loud and chaotic for a few seconds, tires squealing, the stench of burnt rubber, and the deafening bang of the shots. Jack kept low, squeezing himself against the post of the mailbox. His pulse thundered in his ears. Only when the car peeled away did the gunfire cease, leaving the street in a disorienting stillness. He risked a glance around the mailbox. The sedan's taillights shrank into the distance, vanishing into the sprawl of nighttime streets. Shaken, Jack stumbled upright, checking himself for wounds. Miraculously, nothing. He inhaled, ragged and uneven, bracing a hand against the cold metal. That was close. close enough to leave his legs trembling. Before long, red and blue lights raked across the buildings, announcing the police. 2 patrol cars screeched to a halt, and uniformed officers spilled out, weapons drawn. One shone a flashlight in Jack's face. He raised his hands, the universal gesture of surrender. He wasn't used to cops being on his side, but right now, the presence of the authorities was almost a relief. An officer approached, cautious but professional. "You okay? You injured?" "I'm fine," Jack managed, still reeling from the adrenaline crash. "No injuries, I think." Another officer shone a flashlight where the bullets had nicked concrete and metal. "We got a report of shots fired. Do you know who did this?" Jack's lips felt numb, but words tumbled out. He couldn't fabricate a story if he tried, so the truth came in halting gasps. "It's Turk," he said, heart hammering. "Well, Turk's men. They work for a guy named Turk. He runs a local drug ring, I think. I've had run-ins with him." The cluster of officers exchanged looks, apparently recognizing the name. The one with the flashlight frowned. "Turk's crew, huh? Any idea why they'd target you?" Jack exhaled shakily. I guess I pissed them off. Stopped one of their dealers before, talked to the wrong people. Not sure." The lead officer glanced at Jack's security uniform, then turned to another cop. "We'll file the report, see if we can track down the vehicle. For now, sir," he said, shifting his attention back to Jack. "You might want to watch your back. Guys like Turk don't take kindly to folks who interfere in their business." There was a momentary hush as they all stood in the glare of swirling emergency lights. Jack noticed a few bystanders peering from windows or doorways. The sight of police cruisers in the dead of night wasn't uncommon in this part of town, but gunfire always drew a crowd. Another officer took Jack's statement, scribbling notes and asking him to repeat the name of the shooter's boss. Jack had never so openly cooperated with cops before. He typically avoided them at all costs, for obvious reasons. Now his forced honesty made it impossible not to share every relevant detail. Each admission felt like stepping further into uncharted territory. But there was no going back. When they'd gathered enough information, one of the cops clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture of concern. "We'll do what we can, but be careful, all right? If Turk's men wanted you dead, they won't let up." Jack nodded. Adrenaline still throbbed in his veins, leaving him jittery and flushed. He watched as the patrol cars eventually pulled away, their lights fading into the distance. Only the echo of sirens lingered, bouncing off the rows of old buildings. Then he was alone again, standing under the flickering street lamp with shallow breaths and clammy palms. It took him a full minute to collect himself before heading back into the building. Every nerve in his body screamed for him to flee the area, to disappear into the anonymity of the city, but he forced those instincts aside. He had a job, and a bizarre new moral code he was trying to uphold, for better or worse. Somehow, he finished his shift that night, though every time headlights swept across the windows, his heart lurched. By morning, his legs felt like dead weight. He dragged himself home, lay awake in bed for hours, replaying the gunfire in his head. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those muzzle flashes cutting through the darkness. Word traveled fast through the underworld. Like an ominous ripple, news of Jack's cooperation with the police reached Turk by the next afternoon. In a dimly lit corner of a seedy bar, Turk sat with Daz and a couple of other men. A single overhead bulb cast harsh shadows across their faces as they pored over details of last night's near-fatal drive-by. "He gave my name to the cops?" Turk's voice was a measured rumble, the kind that told everyone around him to tread lightly. The tension in the air was palpable. Even Daz, usually cocky, kept his eyes downcast. One of Turk's muscle-bound lieutenants nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, boss. The cops know it was us. They took notes, asked around. Some folks are saying Jack spelled it out." A muscle twitched in Turk's jaw. He took a slow sip from a glass of whiskey, swirling the amber liquid. "He had the nerve to rat me out?" A bitter laugh escaped his lips, though there was no humor in it. "That's not acceptable." Daz shuffled in his seat, clearly uneasy. "We tried to scare him off, that's all. Didn't expect him to go talking to the police." Turk leaned forward, eyes glinting with anger beneath heavy lids. "This man is a problem. He messed with your deal, and now he's messing with my name. Next thing you know, the cops will be sniffing around everything I own." Daz nodded. Give the word, and we'll handle it. Jack won't be a problem anymore. Turk placed his glass on the table with a soft clink that sounded louder than thunder in the hush of the bar. We don't need another messy scene in the streets, he said, though a deadly calm settled in his voice. Figure out a way to make him disappear. Quietly. An undercurrent of grim consensus rippled through the group. They all knew better than to question Turk further. Once he made up his mind, the plan was set in stone. Daz lifted his gaze, a vicious satisfaction dancing across his features now that he had Uncle Turk's explicit blessing. Jack's days were numbered, and everyone at that table knew it. Oblivious to the grim conversation, but certainly not ignorant of the danger, Jack spent the next day flinching at every shadow that crossed his path. He'd gone to bed that morning with an uneasy sense that his luck was wearing thin. If Turk's men had the nerve to shoot at him once, there was no reason they wouldn't try again. Still, he forced himself to return to his security job that evening. He told himself that if he stayed put, there'd be witnesses, cameras, and hopefully enough foot traffic that no one would attempt another drive-by. All was quiet for the first half of his shift, unnervingly so. Jack found himself drifting into old habits, checking corners with the heightened alertness of a seasoned hustler. He walked the corridors methodically, passing flickering overhead lights and vacant offices. Each locked door seemed safe enough, but some primal part of him expected an ambush around every turn. Midnight came and went, the minutes dragging. In the distance, a stray dog howled. A fluorescent bulb buzzed above the lobby, casting a sickly pallor over the worn linoleum. Jack tried to calm his nerves by focusing on the small tasks at hand, double-checking the locks, scanning the monitors, rereading the shift log. But his restless energy only grew with every passing second. Around 2 in the morning, he decided to do an extra patrol outside, hoping the cool air might clear his head. The street was mostly deserted. A lone car idled at the far end of the block, headlights off. Suspicion tugged at Jack's gut. Another set of headlights turned down a cross street, then merged into the distance, leaving the quiet gloom behind. He didn't see or hear anything specifically threatening, but dread clung to him like a damp coat. Finishing his rounds, he headed back toward the building's entrance, just as a dark-colored van swung around the corner with a sudden, predatory speed. Jack froze, every muscle tensing. The van's tires screeched, its headlights washing him in a bright glare. He only had an instant to decide whether to run for the door or dive for cover. Before he could do either, the van lurched to a stop mere feet away. For a split second, time seemed to slow. He glimpsed the silhouette of at least 2 figures inside. The side door slid open, and he caught a flash of black gloves and narrowed eyes. A spike of panic erupted in his chest. He spun on his heel, intending to sprint, but 2 men burst out with swift precision. One of them grabbed his arm in a grip so tight it felt like iron bands clamping down, while the other slammed a forearm across his chest. "Let go!" Jack choked out, the words lost in the slam of adrenaline. He twisted, trying to break free, but they were too strong and moved with practiced efficiency. The men dragged him into the van, ignoring his gasps for breath and frantic struggles. He managed to throw one desperate punch, connecting with the side of someone's jaw, but it barely fazed them. A fist met his temple in retaliation, sending a burst of stars across his vision. The van's interior smelled of stale cigarettes and sweat. Hands pinned his arms to his sides, while the door slammed shut, plunging them into darkness. The engine revved, and in seconds they were speeding away from the curb. Jack's mind spun in delirious terror. All he could think was that he'd been taken. Turk's men, no doubt, and whatever they had planned wouldn't end well. He hadn't even managed to call for help. The squeal of tires echoed in his ears, blending with his own ragged breathing. He tried to see who had grabbed him, but the dim overhead bulb inside the van revealed only vague outlines. Hard faces, grim expressions. One man jabbed a knee into Jack's side, warning him not to struggle further. Another pulled out a phone, likely to inform Turk that they had secured the target. As the van roared down the empty streets, Jack's heart pounded in a chaotic staccato. This was no idle threat. They were taking him somewhere to handle him the way Turk handled all problems, permanently. For the first time, a cold certainty gripped him that he might not escape this alive. Buildings blurred past through the window. Each streetlight flickered, casting fleeting stripes of sickly light across the grim faces of his captors. Jack felt his stomach twist with dread. If he cried out now, who would hear him? If he tried to fight back, could he possibly overpower them? The men's stony silence was more horrifying than any words of threat. It radiated a confidence that everything was under their control. In that paralyzing moment, he realized how alone he was. His new job, his forced honesty, all of it meant nothing if he didn't make it through this night. A faint tremor ran through him, a fear that cut deeper than any con he'd ever pulled. This wasn't about losing money or facing jail. This was about survival. He looked around for some chance of escape. A door latch, a gap in the partition, anything. All he found was the steely glare of the men on either side, as though sensing his desperation. One of them muttered, "Don't even think about it," punctuating the warning by tightening his grip on Jack's arm. The cityscape outside grew unfamiliar. No more tall office buildings or crowded downtown bars, just lonely roads, half lit by distant lamps. Jack swallowed against a lump in his throat. This might be the end. The pulse pounding in his ears whispered one terrifying thought over and over. They're going to kill me. He closed his eyes, trying to keep panic from swallowing him whole. This was it, wasn't it? The final consequence of crossing men like Turk, made inevitable by a twist of fate and a curse of honesty. Even if he tried to talk his way out, he couldn't spin lies. Maybe the truth would save him, or maybe it would damn him quicker. As the van sped onward, Jack fought to breathe through the choking sense of doom. This was not a nightmare he could wake from. The leaden realization dawned, as clear as the engine's roar. He was at Turk's mercy now, and mercy was one thing Turk had in short supply. Part 5. Desert Reckoning. The rhythmic thrum of the van's tires on asphalt drilled into Jack's consciousness like a relentless, suffocating countdown. Wedged between two of Turk's men, he could barely shift, let alone make a break for it. Every attempt to move sent elbows digging into his ribs, heavy hands shoving him back down. The cabin smelled of sweat, stale coffee, and dread. At first, the nighttime cityscape rushed by in a neon-streaked blur outside the windows, but soon the buildings gave way to industrial outskirts, then long stretches of highway sparsely lit by distant stars. Each passing minute placed the glow of civilization farther behind them. Jack's heartbeat thundered in his ears, keeping pace with the hum of the engine. He strained to see out the windshield, but Turk's men said nothing. Their expressions remained stone-like, betraying no emotion or pity. Occasionally, one checked a phone or exchanged curt nods, as if confirming directions. The road stretched on, dark and lonely. Eventually, even the faint glimmer of passing headlights disappeared, leaving them in a barren realm of low-lying desert brush and silent, open sky. A sickening jolt rocked Jack's stomach when the van veered off the main road. The tires crunched over gravel, and the vehicle lurched on uneven ground, sending clouds of dust swirling past the headlights. Jack caught a fleeting glimpse of cactus silhouettes and scraggly desert plants. Worst of all, in the shifting beams of light, he spotted an empty rectangular hole in the earth, freshly dug. Fear spiked so sharply he thought he might black out. It was exactly what it looked like, a grave waiting to be filled. They were going to kill him, bury him where no one would ever find him. Every bone in his body fought the urge to scream, but a strangled breath was all he could manage. The driver cut the engine, and the sudden quiet felt like a physical force. One of the men yanked open the side door, unleashing a gust of cool desert air that carried the faint tang of sagebrush and dust. Rough hands hauled Jack out, stumbling over loose pebbles until he nearly fell to his knees. The moon's pale light revealed a broad stretch of desert floor, and at the far edge of that flat expanse was the raw wound in the ground, his final resting place if he couldn't talk his way out. A pair of headlights cut across the darkness, bouncing off a dirt path as another vehicle approached. Its engine noise rose, and a moment later it stopped a short distance from the van. 4 doors opened, silhouettes stepping out into the moonlight. Jack's lungs tightened at the sight of a tall, imposing figure among them. Turk. Turk walked forward with the unhurried confidence of a king surveying his domain. He was built like a man used to intimidation. Wide shoulders, thick arms, and a quiet gravitas that charged the night air. A flick from one of his men lit a cigarette for him. The brief orange glow lit up Turk's face, revealing eyes that seemed carved from stone. He paused near the edge of the grave, taking a long drag. Without turning, he waved a hand, and the men who held Jack shoved him forward, forcing him into the open. The desert floor felt cold beneath Jack's sneakers. though the night air was warm. His pulse roared in his ears as he stood there, unarmed, no illusions left to shield him. Turk took another drag, exhaling slowly. "You know what this is," he said, voice as calm as if they were discussing the weather. "You crossed me. Now you're standing by an open grave, so I need one good reason not to bury you in it." Jack's throat felt parched as sandpaper. The men behind him tightened their grip on his arms, ensuring he couldn't bolt. Turk's gaze pinned him with a silent dare. To speak, to plead, to beg. And a deep, primal part of Jack wanted to spin a story, to offer a brilliant lie that might earn him mercy. But his tongue refused to shape falsehoods anymore. He swallowed, forcing the words up his dry throat. "If you kill me," Jack rasped, "the cops will come for you. I already told them who you are." A flicker of something passed through Turk's eyes. Curiosity, maybe. Uncertainty. "You told them my name?" Jack drew a trembling breath, bracing himself for a blow. "Yes," he said, each syllable lighting his nerves on fire. "They asked about the drive-by, and I told them it was your men. I told them everything I know." Silence stretched thin across the desert. Turk exhaled a plume of cigarette smoke. His men exchanged uneasy glances, shifting feet on the loose gravel. In the hush, the low nocturnal hum of insects buzzed relentlessly. "You have a death wish?" Turk finally asked, his voice quiet and dangerous. "Why would you go naming me to the police?" "Because I can't lie anymore," Jack said, the confession tumbling out. "If you kill me now, it'll confirm everything. The cops will come right for you." Turk's expression darkened, and the men around him bristled, clearly expecting an order to finish the job. Yet Turk didn't move. He studied Jack as though weighing the truth. Killing Jack here was the logical choice if they wanted immediate vengeance. But Jack knew Turk was also a creature of survival. A high-profile murder would heat up the streets fast. The war of impulses seemed to flare in Turk's eyes. He took one more drag of his cigarette, then flicked it onto the dirt. "You're either the stupidest man alive," he said, "or you're counting on my better nature." Jack forced down a wave of nausea. "I'm just telling you the truth." For a few heart-stopping seconds, no one moved. Then Turk raised a hand, and the desert air felt charged with static. The men holding Jack went tense, as though preparing for a signal. But the boss's hand didn't form a gun. Instead, Turk motioned for them to stand down. "He's not worth this much trouble," Turk declared, voice resolute. "We've got bigger problems than wasting time on a vigilante con man who can't lie." He glared at Jack. "The police already have my name. It won't help to give them a corpse, too." A faint murmur of protest arose from one of the lieutenants, quickly silenced by Turk's lethal stare. Then Turk turned his attention back to Jack, who stood there in stunned relief, knees on the brink of giving out. "I don't want to see your face again," Turk said. "Next time I won't be so forgiving." He turned on his heel, returning to his car. After a pause, his men nodded in terse unison and pushed Jack away from the open grave. They shoved him back into the van, but there was a noticeable difference now, a reluctance, as though each was afraid of disobeying Turk's order. The ride back to the city felt like a fever dream. On the dusty road, the van bounced and rattled, each jolt jarring Jack's raw nerves. But the men didn't strike him or tie him up. They treated him almost gently, as though he were fragile cargo, not worth further damage. No one spoke. The stony tension in the cabin was a stark reminder that, just minutes ago, his life had balanced on a razor's edge. After an hour or more of winding roads and stale air, the glow of distant streetlights appeared on the horizon. Gradually, they re-entered the outskirts of town, passing squat industrial buildings and endless rows of chain-link fences. Jack's breath came shallow, his mind reeling from the near-death confrontation. It was one thing to be threatened or shot at. It was another to stand in front of your own grave. Eventually, the van slowed in a deserted side street. In the muted glow of a lone street lamp, the side door slid open again. One of Turk's men practically lifted Jack to his feet and set him on the sidewalk with a less than gentle shove. "Get lost," he growled. "Boss says you're free. Don't make him regret it." Jack's legs wobbled as he stumbled away from the door. The engine revved, and the van sped off, leaving him standing in a quiet intersection flanked by boarded-up storefronts. The reek of burning rubber lingered in the air. His lungs pulled in a shaky breath. Still alive. Somehow, he was still alive. Sweat trickled down his neck, and adrenaline left him trembling, but the cold realization of what had just happened clung to him like a second skin. Turk had spared his life. Barely. And his honesty, the very thing that ruined his criminal livelihood, had just saved him in a way no cunning lie ever could. Jack stood in the lonely glow of the street lamp for a while, straining to form a coherent thought. At last, he turned and walked away from the darkened street, each step an echo in the night. He didn't know what tomorrow held or how he would keep himself from being dragged into another deadly confrontation, but for now, he was breathing. His heart still pounded, but it beat with a raw, fierce gratitude for a second chance he had no right to expect. He made his way slowly through the sleeping city, unsure whether he'd ever feel safe again, yet deeply aware that, somehow, the truth had offered him an unexpected shield when he needed it most. Turk was gone, the van was gone, and the shallow grave sat abandoned in the desert. But Jack carried the memory of it like a brand, reminding him just how thin the line was between life and death, and how a single flicker of honesty might tip the scales in his favor. Part 6. Redemption's Light. A few days passed before Jack found the courage to return to his usual security rounds. Whatever shadows had threatened him before now seemed to shrink beneath a new dawn of possibility. As he walked through the familiar streets, a subtle shift in the neighborhood's mood caught his attention. A corner store that had once been a hotspot for loiterers now felt safer, the usual cast of shady figures noticeably absent. Word traveled quickly in these parts. Apparently, Turk's crew had chosen to stay off the radar, and whispers circulated about Jack's unflinching honesty. At first, Jack felt uneasy noticing people eyeing him with curiosity or respect. He remembered a time not long ago when he would have preferred to remain invisible, blending into any crowd. Yet now, those sidelong glances carried a different weight, the faint glow of admiration in a place used to fear and suspicion. His name, it seemed, had transformed into a kind of cautionary tale. Someone who had once preyed on the weak, but who now stood as a quiet guardian, guided by a truth he couldn't escape. Tonight, the air was warm and unusually still. Jack made his rounds with measured strides, scanning the buildings and alleys for any flicker of trouble. The beams of his flashlight cut across faded graffiti on old brick, revealing half-torn flyers for neighborhood events. In the distance, a feral cat wove through the shadows, chasing after moths that danced around a buzzing street lamp. At the corner of Maple and 3rd, Jack paused for a moment, letting the hush of the night settle over him. He never expected to find a sense of peace in a job like this, but there it was, a gentle calm, like an unspoken reward for facing life head-on without deceit. He tucked his flashlight under one arm, checking the perimeter door of a closed storefront, when he heard the flap of fabric and the clatter of something hitting the sidewalk. Turning, he spotted a well-dressed man in a light jacket, patting frantically at his pockets. Sure enough, a slim wallet lay a few steps away, half hidden by a stray sheet of newspaper caught in the breeze. The man looked utterly unaware of his loss, hurrying along as though late for an appointment. Months ago, Jack would have scooped up that wallet without a second thought, rifling through for cash or cards, leaving its rightful owner none the wiser. But now, an impulse more powerful than any con stirred in him, guiding him forward with newfound conviction. "Sir," Jack called out, crossing to pick up the wallet. It was sleek, dark leather, a few bills poking out, a handful of credit cards. He raised it above his head to catch the man's attention. "You drop this." The man spun around, relief flooding his features as Jack jogged up to him. "Oh, thank you so much," he said, clearly rattled. "I had no idea." Jack handed it over with a small nod. "Check it. Make sure everything's there." He did, thumbing through the compartments with quick, nervous movements. "All good," he confirmed, beaming at Jack. "You've saved me a world of trouble." Jack shrugged off the praise, but warmth spread through his chest. "Glad to help. Take care out there." The man offered another grateful nod and hurried on his way. Jack turned back, satisfied he'd done the right thing, only to notice a small figure standing half in the shadows, half in the warm halo of a street lamp. A young boy, jacket sleeves a bit too long, curly hair just visible beneath the hood. Kody. He must have been drawn by the small commotion. Eyes wide, Kody watched the exchange with an almost electric excitement on his face. Then, recognizing Jack, he stepped forward, beaming a silent, radiant smile. When Jack caught his gaze, the child raised his thumb in a proud, triumphant gesture, as if cheering on a hero. For a second, Jack couldn't speak. He felt something catch in his throat. Gratitude, humility, maybe even awe. Kody was the child who'd set this strange new path in motion, whose innocent declaration had shattered Jack's world of lies. Now, instead of feeling anger or regret, Jack felt only a sweeping sense of calm. Slowly, Jack lifted his own hand and gave Kody a thumbs up in return. An unspoken understanding passed between them in the quiet city street. Acknowledgement that whatever magic had compelled Jack into honesty had also guided him toward redemption. Cody's bright grin lit up the darkness like a lighthouse. A soft breeze stirred, rustling the leaves in the sparse trees that lined the sidewalk. For a moment, everything felt perfectly still, as if the city itself had taken a breath. Jack realized, with a clarity that stung his eyes, that he didn't miss the adrenaline rush of the con or the easy money pilfered from unsuspecting marks. He didn't hunger for the old life that revolved around scanning QR codes or swapping rings. All he wanted was to keep walking this path, where he could sleep at night without the weight of deceit on his conscience. The curse, if that's what one called it, had forced him to reveal truths he once buried. Yet here he was, strangely whole, unexpectedly content. He took one last look at Kody, who nodded with a mischievous yet heartfelt grin, then melted back into the evening, leaving Jack alone under the glow of the street lamp. A sense of peace spread through him, deeper than he ever thought possible. The city lights stretched ahead, reflecting off puddles in the road and casting dancing reflections on the old brick facades. As he resumed his patrol, Jack carried with him a certainty he'd never known in all his years of hustling. His days of deceit were finished, replaced by a purpose that went beyond mere survival. In each footstep, he felt a renewed dedication to the truth, a moral clarity he could finally embrace without fear of losing himself. By the time he reached the end of the block, he paused and glanced over his shoulder, as though half expecting Kody to still be there. The sidewalk was empty, except for the gentle flicker of a faulty neon sign near a closed bakery. Yet Jack sensed that the boy's parting smile lingered in the air, an unspoken blessing on this fresh chapter of his life. On that night, under the quiet canopy of street lamps and drifting stars, Jack Bennett felt redemption, and realized he was no longer running from the world, or from who he'd become. Instead, he took another step forward, letting the soft hum of the city guide him, confident in his resolve to remain honest and protect those who crossed his path. And in a final fleeting moment, Jack smiled to himself, aware that the simplest truths often held the greatest power, even if it took a 5-year-old's decree to show him the way. The end.